My name is Linnea Vance. I am 32 years old. For exactly 1,826 days, I lived above a secret that was slowly breathing under my feet. My husband Alden kept the basement of our meticulously restored Victorian home secured with a heavy-duty biometric steel door. He told me it was due to a cracked foundation. He told me about toxic black mold, about asbestos from the 1920s that would cost an absolute fortune to safely abate. He told me, looking deep into my eyes with that terrifyingly gentle gaze of his, that keeping it sealed was for my own safety. I believed him. I believed everything Alden ever told me. But last Tuesday, when my husband boarded a direct flight for an architectural symposium in Zurich, I hired a private off-the-books locksmith to drill through the steel frame of that door. What I found at the bottom of those narrow, creaking wooden stairs wasn't a structural hazard. It wasn't mold or rotting wood. It was a perfectly preserved, climate-controlled shrine dedicated entirely to my older sister, Serafina, the same sister who supposedly drowned in a tragic, freak-boating accident 5 years ago. But that wasn't the thing that made the air freeze in my lungs. The thing that made my knees give out was what sat in the center of that immaculate room. On a vintage vanity illuminated by harsh, bright bulbs, there was a fresh cup of black coffee, a half-empty bottle of her signature gardenia perfume, and a receipt from a local pharmacy. The receipt was dated yesterday, and the signature at the bottom was hers. Before we dive into the darkest day of my entire life, I want to ask you something. Have you ever looked at the person sleeping next to you and realized you have absolutely no idea who they really are? If you have, please take a moment to hit the like button. Drop the word truth in the comments, along with your current city and local time. I need to know I'm not shouting into the void here. I need to know there are people out there who understand what it means to have your reality entirely dismantled in the span of 30 seconds. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare actually began. To understand the sheer magnitude of Alden's deception, you have to understand the gravity of Serafina. Growing up in the Vance household, there were 2 daughters, but only one son. Serafina was 3 years older than me, and she didn't just walk into rooms, she orchestrated them. She was vibrant, chaotic, breathtakingly beautiful, and effortlessly brilliant. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, worshipped the very ground she walked on. They were legacy academics in a quiet New England town, the kind of people who valued intellectual prestige and social charm above all else. Serafina possessed both in staggering amounts. I was the quiet one, the understudy, the one who spent family dinners pushing peas around my plate while Serafina held court, telling stories that made my parents lean forward, utterly captivated. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being the shadow to a blinding light. You learn to make yourself small. You learn to require nothing. When I was 16, I won a regional poetry competition. I spent weeks pouring my soul into a piece about feeling invisible. The award ceremony was on a Thursday evening. My parents promised they would be there. I stood on the stage, clutching my little paper certificate, scanning the auditorium. The 2 seats they had reserved were empty. When I walked home alone in the rain, I found them in the living room, opening a bottle of champagne. Serafina had just been cast as the lead in her university's theater production, a play happening 3 states away. "Oh, Linnea, sweetheart, we're so sorry," my mother had said, barely looking away from Serafina. "But this is a pivotal moment for your sister's career. Your little poem will still be there tomorrow." I stopped writing after that. I stopped trying to compete for an audience that had already bought tickets to someone else's show. And that dynamic, that quiet, desperate acceptance of being second best, set the stage for Alden. Alden entered our lives 7 years ago. He was a rising star in a boutique architectural firm, 30 years old, devastatingly charming, and driving a restored classic Porsche. And, naturally, he belonged to Serafina. They met at an art gallery opening in Boston. From the moment he brought her home for Thanksgiving, the family was mesmerized. Alden was exactly the kind of man my parents envisioned for their golden child. He was affluent, cultured, and looked at Serafina like she was the only woman on the planet. I watched them from the corner of the living room, sipping my cider, feeling that familiar dull ache in my chest. Alden was polite to me, of course. He would ask about my day, listen with a polite smile, and then immediately turn his attention back to my sister. I was just the background scenery in their sweeping romance. But Serafina was a restless spirit. She didn't like being tied down, even by someone as perfect as Alden. They fought constantly. Explosive, cinematic arguments that always ended with dramatic reconciliations. Until the summer of 2021. The 14th of August 2021. A date permanently burned into the architecture of my brain. We were all staying at my parents' lake house in upstate New York. Serafina and Alden had been arguing all morning. I didn't know what it was about, but I heard the slamming doors, the raised voices. At 4 in the afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. A sudden squall was rolling in. Serafina, in a fit of rage, grabbed the keys to the small motorboat. She shouted that she needed space, that Alden was suffocating her. Alden tried to stop her, grabbing her arm on the dock, but she shoved him away and sped off into the churning gray water. That was the last time any of us ever saw her. The storm hit with a ferocity no one anticipated. The wind howled. The rain came down in blinding sheets. By nightfall, the boat was found capsized near the rocky eastern shore. The Coast Guard searched for 6 days. They found her life jacket snagged on a submerged branch. They found her waterproof watch. But they never found Serafina. The lake was notoriously deep, full of unpredictable undercurrents. On the 7th day, the search was officially transitioned from a rescue to a recovery. A month later, she was declared legally dead. The Vance family shattered. My parents aged 10 years in a matter of weeks. They turned my childhood home into a mausoleum of grief, speaking in hushed tones, playing her favorite music, utterly inconsolable. And Alden. Alden was a ghost. He lost weight. He stopped working. He sat on our porch for hours, staring out at nothing. In the absence of the sun, the shadow finally had to step forward. I became the caretaker for everyone's grief. I cooked the meals. I handled the legal paperwork. I sat with my mother while she wept, and I sat with Alden in the silence of the night. Over the next year, trauma created a bridge between us. Alden and I were the only 2 people who truly understood the massive, gaping void Serafina had left behind. Our shared grief slowly, imperceptibly, mutated into dependency. One night, a year after the accident, he broke down in my arms. He looked at me, his eyes hollow and desperate, and said, "You're the only piece of her I have left. You're the only one who understands." I should have seen the red flag woven into those words. He wasn't falling in love with me. He was falling in love with my proximity to her. But I was 26, drowning in a lifetime of neglect, and the most captivating man I had ever met was finally looking at me. We were married 18 months later, a quiet courthouse ceremony. No white dress, no big reception. My parents didn't even attend. They said it was inappropriate, a betrayal to Serafina's memory. They cut me off almost completely after that. I traded my family for Alden. We bought the house a month after the wedding. It was a sprawling, 3-story Victorian in a secluded, heavily wooded neighborhood in Connecticut. Alden was obsessed with it. He said it was an architectural masterpiece that he wanted to restore with his own 2 hands. But the house came with a bizarre stipulation. Before we even signed the closing papers, Alden had a massive steel door installed at the top of the basement stairs. It was outfitted with a biometric fingerprint scanner. "The foundation is compromised, Linnea," he had told me, his tone authoritative but warm. The inspection report showed massive amounts of black mold and degraded asbestos. "If we open that door, the spores will circulate through the HVAC system. It's dangerous. I don't want you anywhere near it until I can secure the permits to have it professionally gutted." I didn't question it. Why would I? I knew nothing about architecture or home restoration. For 5 years, that door remained locked. For 5 years, I built a life above it. I started a successful graphic design business from our second-floor office. I made dinners. I hosted Alden's colleagues. I played the role of the devoted, supportive wife. But there were cracks. Small, imperceptible fissures in the reality Alden had constructed around me. Alden spent an inordinate amount of time working late. He would often go down to the basement through the exterior cellar storm doors he had also reinforced with heavy padlocks. He claimed he was doing structural assessments, wearing a hazmat suit, taking air quality samples. Sometimes he would be down there until 3 in the morning. When he came back to bed, he always smelled faintly of bleach and something else. Something sweet, a scent I couldn't quite place, but one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then came the noises. It started about 3 years into the marriage. I was in the kitchen, rolling out pie dough late at night while Alden was away on a business trip. The house was dead silent. Suddenly, through the floorboards, I heard a sound. A dull, rhythmic thudding. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the settling of old pipes. It wasn't mice. It sounded like footsteps. Measured, pacing footsteps. I froze. the rolling pin gripped tight in my flour-dusted hands. I pressed my ear to the hardwood floor. Silence. Then, a faint, metallic scrape, like a chair being pushed back across concrete. When Alden returned, I told him about it. He laughed it off, wrapping his arms around my waist, kissing the top of my head. It's the old boiler, Linnea. Water hammer effect. The pipes expand and contract in the cold. You're letting this big old house spook you. He was so convincing, so rational. I let it go. I wanted to be the easy, uncomplicated wife. I wanted to be the antithesis of Serafina's chaos. But last month, the illusion finally shattered. I was doing our taxes. Alden usually handled all our finances, but he had left his laptop unlocked on the kitchen island while he took a shower. An email notification popped up in the corner of the screen. A digital receipt from a high-end boutique in Manhattan. The charge was for $3,400. The item, a vintage silk emerald green evening gown. Size 4. I am a size 10. I do not wear emerald green. It washes me out. My hands trembled as I opened his email client. I searched the past 12 months. I found credit card statements for an account I didn't know existed. Thousands of dollars spent at artisanal bakeries, boutique clothing stores, cosmetic counters, deliveries made to a P.O. box in a town 30 miles away. My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. Alden was having an affair. It was the only logical explanation. He had a whole other life. A whole other woman he was spoiling while I sat in this isolated Victorian house, managing his calendar and cooking his meals. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I did exactly what my mother taught me to do when faced with humiliation. I swallowed it, and I calculated my next move. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly who she was. The opportunity arrived last Tuesday. Alden was scheduled to present at a global architectural symposium in Zurich. A 3-day trip. He packed his bags, kissed my forehead, and told me he loved me. Don't forget to set the alarm, he said, his eyes perfectly clear, entirely devoid of guilt. And remember, the HVAC guys are coming next month, so I'll finally be dealing with the basement. I watched his car disappear down the long driveway. I waited 2 hours. I watched his flight status turn to in air on the airline tracker. Then, I picked up my phone and called a locksmith. Not a regular commercial locksmith. A guy named Marcus, who I found on a dark web forum. Someone who specialized in bypassing biometric security for repossessed properties. I paid him $1,500 in cash. Marcus arrived in an unmarked van. He was a quiet, burly man who took one look at the steel door in my hallway and whistled. "This isn't to keep a draft out, lady," he muttered, unpacking a heavy-duty tungsten carbide drill. "This is vault-grade steel. Someone really didn't want you getting down there." "Just open it," I said, my voice eerily calm. It took him 2 agonizing hours. The sound of the drill biting into the metal echoed through the empty house, a screaming, high-pitched mechanical wail that set my teeth on edge. With every millimeter the drill advanced, my heart hammered harder against my ribs. What was he hiding? Was it a second life? Was it a stash of stolen money? Or was it just the physical evidence of his affair? Finally, with a loud metallic clack, the locking mechanism gave way. Marcus packed up his tools, took his envelope of cash, and left without asking a single question. I stood at the top of the stairs. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. I expected to be hit with the smell of mildew, of stagnant water and rotting timber. But as I pushed the door open, a rush of cool, impeccably conditioned air brushed against my face. And carrying on that air was a scent so distinct, so fiercely familiar, that the floor seemed to tilt out from under me. Gardenias. My hand found the light switch on the wall. I flipped it. Fluorescent lights hummed to life, sequentially illuminating a staircase that had been covered in plush, pristine cream carpeting. I took a step down. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The silence was absolute, save for the faint hum of a high-end dehumidifier. I reached the bottom landing and stepped into a space that defied every law of reality I had ever known. The basement was massive, covering the entire footprint of the house. But it wasn't a basement anymore. It was an apartment. A flawless, high-end, obsessively decorated apartment. There were Persian rugs on the floor, a velvet tufted sofa, a kitchenette stocked with expensive teas. But the walls were what made a scream lodge itself sideways in my throat. Every single inch of the drywall was covered in photographs. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Some were old, from our childhood, stolen from my parents' house. But most of them were recent, candids taken from a distance. Photos of Serafina at a coffee shop. Serafina reading on a park bench. Serafina getting into a cab. My sister wasn't dead. I stumbled backward, knocking into a small wooden table. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. In the center of the room was a vintage vanity mirror, framed by glowing bulbs. I walked toward it, drawn by a horrifying magnetic pull. On the vanity sat the emerald green silk dress, perfectly pressed, draped over a chair. Next to it, a half-empty bottle of her gardenia perfume. I reached out and touched the glass bottle. It was warm from the heat of the vanity lights. And right beside the perfume was a white paper receipt. CVS Pharmacy, dated yesterday, 4:15 p.m. Items, prenatal vitamins. At the bottom of the receipt, signed in that chaotic, looping cursive I had spent my entire childhood envying, was the name, Serafina Vance. I stood in the center of my husband's secret world, the oxygen leaving the room, realizing that for 5 years I hadn't been a wife. I had been a warden to a ghost, and the man I married was the architect of my sister's resurrection. I stared at the signature until the looping letters blurred into a chaotic, venomous web of black ink. My lungs forgot how to expand. The air in the room was perfectly chilled, scientifically balanced by the silent hum of the climate control system, yet I felt as though I were standing in the center of a roaring furnace. I dropped the receipt. It fluttered through the air, landing softly on the meticulously vacuumed fibers of an authentic Persian rug. My sister wasn't dead. She wasn't lying at the bottom of a freezing, murky lake in upstate New York. She hadn't been swallowed by the dark undercurrents while I stood on the shore, screaming her name until my vocal cords tore. She was here. She had been here the entire time. A violent wave of nausea slammed into me, so intense I had to grip the edge of the vintage vanity just to stay upright. My reflection in the brightly lit mirror was ghastly, my skin, the color of old parchment, my eyes wide and bloodshot, completely devoid of the quiet, composed woman I had forced myself to be for the last 5 years. I turned away from the glass, terrified of my own face, and began to truly look at the prison my husband had built. But as my eyes scanned the perimeter of the sprawling, open-concept basement, the horrifying truth began to curdle in my stomach. This wasn't a prison, it was a palace. I forced my legs to move, my footsteps completely absorbed by the thick, cream-colored carpeting. To my left was a living area that looked like it had been ripped from the pages of an architectural digest. A massive, crushed velvet sectional faced an 80-inch flat-screen television. Beside it, a towering mahogany bookshelf was lined with first-edition novels, expensive art, and framed photographs. I walked closer, my hands trembling violently. The photographs weren't just of Serafina. They were of Serafina and Alden. There was a picture of them clinking champagne glasses in what looked like a private jet. A photo of them standing on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking a turquoise ocean. A candid shot of Alden kissing her cheek while she laughed, her head thrown back, radiating that blinding, impossible solar energy she had always possessed. My eyes darted to the date stamped in the corner of one of the Polaroids. December 2023, 2 years after her funeral. A year and a half after Alden stood in front of a judge and swore to love and cherish me until death parted us. I backed away from the shelf, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. I stumbled toward the far end of the room, where a fully functional kitchenette gleamed under recessed lighting. There was a full-sized stainless steel refrigerator, an induction cooktop, and a marble island. I opened the refrigerator. It wasn't stocked with survival rations. It was filled with imported French cheeses, organic fresh produce, bottles of sparkling water, and her favorite vintage of Pinot Noir. How had he managed this? How had he brought all this down here without me noticing? I looked up at the ceiling. The drywall was different from the rest of the house. It was layered with thick, acoustic soundproofing panels. I recognized the material from a recording studio I had once designed a logo for. Alden hadn't just locked a door. He had retrofitted the entire foundation to be an impenetrable acoustic vault. The structural issues he claimed would cost a fortune to fix were actually the cover story for a massive, covert renovation. The late nights he spent working down here in his hazmat suit. He was building her a luxury bunker. I spun around, desperate to understand the logistics of her captivity. If she was down here, how did she survive the isolation? My eyes landed on the exterior cellar storm doors at the far end of the room, the doors that Alden had secured with heavy industrial padlocks from the outside. I walked toward them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I reached the doors, I saw the truth. The heavy padlocks were a facade. On the inside of the steel doors, there was a simple, brass thumb-turned deadbolt and an electronic keypad. Serafina wasn't trapped. She wasn't a hostage. She could leave whenever she wanted. The padlocks on the outside were just theatrical props to keep me from trying to open them from the yard. She had the code. She had the freedom. The receipt from the pharmacy. She hadn't signed it while sitting down here in the dark. She had walked into a CVS in broad daylight. My mind spun violently, trying to process the sheer monolithic scale of the betrayal. If she could leave, why was she hiding? Why fake her death? Why put our parents through an agony so profound it permanently shattered their minds? The answer was sitting on a sleek, minimalist glass desk tucked into the corner of the room. I crossed the carpet, my legs feeling like they were moving through deep water. On the desk sat a high-end laptop, a silver paperweight, and a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The laptop was asleep. I tapped the spacebar. The screen illuminated, requesting a password. I ignored it and reached for the leather portfolio. It was heavy, bursting with documents. I unzipped the binder and let the papers spill out onto the glass surface. The very first document was a certified copy of a death certificate. Serafina Vance. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Beneath it was a letter from a major global life insurance conglomerate. The logo was embossed in thick gold ink. I read the bold, black text, and the final puzzle piece slammed into place with a sickening, bone-crushing force. It was a payout confirmation. For a policy Serafina had taken out exactly 1 year before the boating accident. The payout amount was staggering. $15 million. And the sole, irrevocable beneficiary was Alden. They hadn't just faked a tragedy. They had orchestrated a $15 million heist. The explosive fights, the dramatic storm, the perfectly timed accident, it was all a meticulously choreographed stage play. Serafina hadn't drowned. She had probably swum to a prearranged extraction point where Alden was waiting for her. They had played the grieving widower and the tragic victim to absolute perfection, cashing a check that set them up for multiple lifetimes. But the question clawed at the inside of my skull, demanding an answer. Why me? If they had $15 million, they could have disappeared to an island in the Mediterranean. They could have bought a villa in Tuscany and lived under assumed names. Why buy a Victorian house in Connecticut? Why force Serafina to live in a subterranean apartment? And most importantly, why did Alden marry the boring, invisible younger sister? I dug frantically through the scattered papers, my hands shaking so badly I tore several pages. Bank statements, offshore account routing numbers, deeds to properties in shell companies. And then, I found a manila folder with my name written on the tab in Alden's precise architectural handwriting, Linea. I opened it. Inside were my medical records, my financial credit history, my business tax returns, and a printed email exchange between Alden and a lawyer. I read the email, the words burning themselves into my retinas. Alden, the lawyer wrote, "The insurance investigators have finalized their probe. The payout is cleared. However, you must remain geographically anchored for at least 5 years to avoid triggering a post-payout fraud audit. Buying the historic property in Connecticut establishes perfect optics. A grieving widower settling down to restore a home." Alden's reply was underneath it. "Understood. And what about the family? Arthur and Eleanor are wealthy, resourceful, and entirely obsessed with Serafina. If they suspect anything, they have the funds to hire private investigators who will tear my life apart." The lawyer's response was clinical. "You need a permanent buffer. You need a reason for them to completely disown you and never set foot near your property. You need an unforgivable offense." An unforgivable offense. I dropped the paper. It hit the glass desk with a soft, pathetic slap. I was the unforgivable offense. By seducing me, by marrying the younger sister while the family was still suffocating under the weight of Serafina's death, Alden committed the ultimate betrayal in the eyes of my parents. He knew Arthur and Eleanor would view my compliance as a grotesque treason. He knew they would cut me off. He knew they would never, ever come to visit me. He didn't marry me because he found comfort in our shared grief. He married me to build an impenetrable social moat around this house. I was the perfect, invisible human shield. I estranged the family, isolating the property, ensuring that Serafina could live comfortably beneath my feet without the threat of unexpected visitors. I fell to my knees. The carpet fibers pressed into my skin. I wrapped my arms around my stomach and let out a sound that I didn't recognize, a guttural, ragged wheeze of pure, unadulterated agony. I had spent 5 years serving this man. I had cooked his meals, washed his clothes, managed his schedule, and loved him with a pathetic, desperate gratitude. I had sacrificed my parents, my heritage, my entire identity, all because I thought I had finally found someone who chose me over her. But nobody ever chose me. I was just the unpaid security guard for their multi-million-dollar fraud. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, drowning in a psychological abyss so dark I thought it might actually crush my organs. But then, a soft, rhythmic blinking caught my eye. Beneath the glass desk, tucked into a ventilated server rack, was a black tower with a matrix of blue LED lights. It was a high-end surveillance system. I pulled myself off the floor, my grief suddenly mutating into a cold, lethal adrenaline. I sat in the leather desk chair and traced the wires from the server up to a secondary monitor that I hadn't noticed, pushed to the edge of the desk. I pressed the power button on the monitor. The screen flickered, then split into 8 high-definition video feeds. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. Feed 1 was the kitchen upstairs. Feed 2 was the living room. Feed 3 was my graphic design office. Feed 4 was the front porch. Feed 5 was the backyard. Feed 6 was my bedroom. The camera angle was top-down, clearly hidden inside the smoke detector directly above the bed I shared with Alden. I stared at the feed, watching the empty, perfectly made duvet cover, realizing with a sickening horror that Serafina had been watching me. She had watched me sleep. She had watched me dress. She had watched Alden and me. My stomach violently rebelled. I clamped a hand over my mouth, swallowing down the bitter taste of bile. Next to the monitor, resting innocuously next to a sleek pen holder, was a thick, leather-bound notebook, a journal. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled it open. The pages were filled with Serafina's elegant, looping cursive, the same handwriting from the pharmacy receipt, the same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards when we were children. I began to read. It was not a diary of a woman in hiding. It was a chronicle of pure sociopathic arrogance. October 12th. Linnea made that hideous pot roast again today. I could smell the garlic seeping through the vents. It made me gag. I texted Alden while he was eating it at the table with her. I told him if he didn't come down here and bring me sushi immediately, I was going to turn up the bass on the sound system and rattle her cheap wine glasses. He made an excuse about a headache and came down 10 minutes later. He tastes so much better than her. I flipped the page, my fingers entirely numb. November teared. Watching her on the monitors is becoming my favorite reality show. She is so pathetic. She spent an hour crying in the office today, looking at an old photo of me. I almost felt bad for her, but then I remembered how easily she spread her legs for my fiancé the second I was out of the picture. She deserves this little domestic prison. Alden had to sleep upstairs again last night to keep up appearances. He hates touching her. He comes down here afterward and showers for 20 minutes just to wash her cheap lotion off his skin. A singular, scalding tear broke free and tracked down my cheek, hitting the parchment of the journal. The cruelty was so absolute, so refined, it felt like a physical knife twisting between my ribs. Serafina wasn't just surviving down here. She was thriving on my humiliation. She was the queen of her underground castle, watching her court jester perform upstairs for her amusement. I turned another chunk of pages, landing on an entry from just a week ago. May 24th. The nausea is finally passing. The doctor confirmed it today. 10 weeks. Alden is ecstatic. We're going to name him Arthur, after Dad. It's hilariously poetic. The insurance audit window officially closes in 4 months. Once the funds are fully decentralized into the Cayman accounts, Alden is going to file for divorce. He's going to tell Linnea he just can't overcome his grief. She'll pack her little bags and leave, completely destroyed, and then we're selling this moldy old Victorian and moving to the Maldives. I can't wait to feel the sun on my face again. I can't wait to be a mother. I just have to survive 4 more months of hearing her annoying, heavy footsteps above my head. Pregnant. The prenatal vitamins. The emerald green dress. The Zurich trip. Wait, the Zurich trip. I looked at the date on the pharmacy receipt again. Yesterday. Alden didn't go to Zurich for an architectural symposium. Zurich was a banking capital. He was flying to Switzerland to manually decentralize the final blocks of the $15 million. He was finalizing the escape plan. They were getting ready to cut me loose. Or worse, if I was the only loose end tying them to the fraud. What would a man who faked his fiancée's death be willing to do to his easily disposable wife? Suddenly, my eyes darted to the surveillance monitor. The timestamp in the bottom right corner of the screen ticked forward. 4:18 p.m. On feed 5, the backyard camera, a movement caught my eye. A sleek black town car had silently pulled up to the rear access road that bordered the edge of the woods behind our property. The passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. She was wearing a tailored tan trench coat, oversized dark sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat. Even obscured, I would recognize the graceful, commanding geometry of her posture anywhere in the world. It was Serafina. She had a designer shopping bag hooked over her arm. She paused, looking around the deserted, heavily wooded yard, ensuring nobody was watching. Then, she walked directly toward the exterior cellar storm doors. My lungs seized. The air vanished from the room. She was coming back. Alden was in Zurich, and she had taken the opportunity to go out, to shop, to breathe fresh air, confident that her idiot sister was upstairs, completely oblivious, locked behind the biometric steel door. I watched the screen in paralyzed horror as Serafina reached the storm doors. She pulled a small remote from her pocket and clicked it. On the monitor, I saw the heavy exterior locks disengage. She pulled the heavy doors upward, the sunlight spilling briefly into the dark concrete stairwell that led down to the interior basement door. She was descending the stairs. In less than 30 seconds, she would open the deadbolt. She would step into this room. She would see the drilled steel door at the top of the internal stairs. She would see me standing at her desk, holding her journal. I had no weapon. I had no escape route. If I ran up the internal stairs, she would hear me. If she had $15 million and her freedom on the line, she would not let me walk out of this house alive. A woman who could psychologically torture her own parents into early graves would not hesitate to kill the sister who discovered her secret. On the audio feed, I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a key sliding into the deadbolt on the other side of the room. Click. The brass lock began to turn. The brass lock finished its serpentine rotation with a heavy, definitive thud. The handle began to press downward. My brain short-circuited, instantly reverting to the primal, terrifying arithmetic of prey. I had less than 2 seconds. I couldn't run up the interior stairs. The metallic screech of the drilled door would echo through the acoustic vault of the basement, and she would hear exactly where I was. I spun wildly, my eyes desperately scanning the immaculate, sprawling room. To the left of the vanity, partially obscured by a decorative folding screen, was a set of louvered double doors. The walk-in closet. I lunged for it, my stockinged feet sliding across the Persian rug. I grabbed the brass handles, yanked the doors open, threw myself into the absolute darkness, and pulled them shut just as the heavy exterior storm door swung open on its reinforced hinges. I scrambled backward, pressing myself deep into the farthest corner of the closet, burying my body behind a thick row of designer winter coats. The closet smelled overwhelmingly of cedar and that cloying, unmistakable gardenia perfume. I clamped both of my hands over my nose and mouth, violently forcing my breathing to slow, terrified that the frantic, jackhammer rhythm of my heart would vibrate through the wooden slats. Through the narrow gaps in the louvered doors, I had a fractured, vertical view of the main living space. Footsteps. Slow, confident, completely unhurried. Serafina stepped into the frame of my vision. Seeing a ghost in the flesh is a phenomenon that completely breaks the human mind. For 5 years, I had mourned this woman. I had stood in the freezing rain at an empty gravesite, weeping until my tear ducts ran dry. I had watched my mother's mind disintegrate from the sorrow of losing her. And here she was, in vibrant, breathing, horrifying technicolor. She took off her oversized sunglasses and tossed them onto the crushed velvet sectional. She looked spectacular. Her dark hair was styled in an effortless blowout, cascading over the shoulders of her expensive trench coat. Her skin possessed that luminous, untouchable glow of extreme wealth. But as she unbuttoned the coat and let it slide off her shoulders, I saw the undeniable curvature of her stomach. The 10-week pregnancy. Alden's child. The heir to $15 million of blood money. She hummed a quiet, melodic tune as she picked up her shopping bags and carried them toward the kitchenette. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, sliced a piece of imported lemon, and dropped it into the glass. It was a macabre domestic pantomime of a normal life, happening in a subterranean bunker funded by a staged tragedy. I watched her through the wooden slats, my terror slowly, agonizingly bleeding into something entirely different. It was a cold, dense, black rage. A fury so immense it felt like it was altering my actual DNA. This woman had orchestrated the utter annihilation of my life. She had watched me on a monitor, laughing while I cried over her memory. Serafina took a sip of her water and turned toward the glass desk. The humming stopped. The silence that fell over the acoustic vault was instantaneous and absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator realizing its den has been breached. Through the slats, I watched her body go entirely rigid. She was staring at the desk, at the scattered bank statements, at the leather portfolio, and most damning of all, at the open journal resting precisely where I had dropped it. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. The golden child of the Vance family possessed a sociopathic composure that was utterly terrifying to witness. Very slowly, she set the glass of water down on the marble island. She moved toward the desk with the silent, fluid grace of a hunting cat. She looked down at the open journal. She looked at the server rack housing the surveillance equipment. Then, very slowly, her head pivoted toward the back of the room, toward the interior staircase leading up to the main house. From her vantage point, she could see the faint, unnatural strip of yellow hallway light bleeding through the cracked, drilled steel door at the top of the stairs. She knew. Serafina reached under the lip of the glass desk. There was a faint click, followed by the sound of a hidden drawer sliding open. When her hand emerged, my stomach violently inverted, turning entirely to ice. She was holding a matte black handgun. Screwed onto the barrel was a cylindrical suppressor. Alden hadn't just built her a luxury cage. He had armed her. They were sitting on a fortune, committing federal fraud of the highest magnitude. Of course, they had a contingency plan for interlopers. But this wasn't just a home defense weapon. The silencer meant this weapon was designated for quiet executions. Serafina checked the chamber with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. Then, keeping the gun raised, she reached into her pocket with her left hand and pulled out her cell phone. She tapped the screen, raising it to her ear. I strained to listen, my hands gripping the sleeves of the fur coat hiding my body. "Answer," Serafina hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "Pick up the damn phone, Alden." A moment later, a voice crackled through the phone speaker. Even distorted by the cellular connection, the smooth, authoritative timbre of my husband's voice sent a violent shockwave of revulsion through my nervous system. "Sarah, my love," Alden said, sounding perfectly relaxed. I could hear the faint, ambient chatter of a busy airport terminal in the background. "I'm in the first-class lounge at JFK. Flight to Zurich boards in 40 minutes. Did the transfer clear your end?" "We have a massive problem," Serafina said, her eyes locked on the drilled door at the top of the stairs. The parasite found the basement. The silence on the other end of the line was so profound I could almost hear the gears grinding in Alden's head. "Repeat that," Alden said, his tone instantly dropping an octave, stripping away all the warmth, revealing the cold, reptilian architecture beneath his charm. "She drilled the biometric lock," Serafina said, her knuckles turning white around the grip of the handgun. "She's been down here. She went through the portfolio. She read my journal. She knows everything, Alden. The life insurance, the pregnancy, the accounts. All of it." "Where is she right now?" Alden demanded, his voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "I don't know," Serafina whispered, sweeping the gun across the room, the barrel passing inches from the louvered doors of the closet where I stood paralyzed. "The interior door is open. She must have run back upstairs into the main house when she heard the exterior storm doors unlocking. Or she's hiding down here." "Listen to me very carefully, Sarah," Alden said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unfiltered psychopathy. "Do not panic. We planned for worst-case scenarios. If she's in the house, she hasn't called the police yet, otherwise there would be sirens. She's probably terrified, trying to figure out what to do. You have the firearm?" "Yes," she confirmed. "Good," Alden said, the background noise of the airport terminal continuing, completely oblivious to the murder being plotted in its midst. "We are moving the timeline up. We are not waiting 4 months. We leave tonight. I will skip this flight, rent a car off-grid and drive back. But you need to contain her. Do you understand? She cannot leave that property." "I'm going to kill her, Alden," Serafina said, her voice completely devoid of empathy. She sounded inconvenienced, annoyed that she had to deal with a mess. "I am going to put a bullet in her pathetic head." "No," Alden commanded sharply. "No bullets. A gunshot wound opens a massive forensic homicide investigation. We don't need detectives pulling the floorboards of that house. We use the original contingency. The cyanide compound is in the lockbox under the bathroom sink. It's odorless and mimics a massive cardiac event." My knees buckled. I caught myself against the wall of the closet, biting down on my own tongue so hard that the metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. The original contingency. They had planned this. From the very beginning, they had procured a lethal, untraceable poison specifically meant for me. I was never just an alibi. I was always livestock, being kept in the pasture until it was time for the slaughter. You want me to force-feed her poison while I'm pregnant? Serafina snapped, taking a slow step toward the interior stairs. She's weak, but she'll fight. It's too messy. Then use the rope, Alden countered, his voice dripping with terrifying pragmatism. The braided nylon rope in the utility closet. You catch her off guard. You secure it around her neck, and you drop her from the second-floor banister. We stage it as a suicide. The devastated wife, driven to madness after discovering her husband's secret affair. She hangs herself while he's on a business trip to Switzerland. It's a clean narrative. The local police will eat it up. I'll come home to a tragic scene, play the grieving widower again, and then I sell the house and disappear with you. A hanging, Serafina mused, a twisted, genuine smile creeping across her lips. Poetic. The quiet sister finally makes a loud exit. Sarah, listen to me, Alden said. Lock the exterior doors from the inside right now. Do not let her escape into the woods. Then, systematically sweep the main house. Do not engage her in a fair fight. Ambush her. Strike her from behind. Stun her. Then secure the rope. I am turning my phone off to board a domestic flight back to Hartford under the alias. I will be there in 3 hours to help you clean up and stage the scene. 3 hours, Serafina repeated, her eyes glowing with a dark, predatory thrill. Drive fast, darling. I might not leave much of her for you to see. I love you, Alden said, completely detached from the monstrosity of his words. I love you too, Serafina replied, and ended the call. She slipped the phone into her pocket and gripped the suppressed handgun with both hands. She turned toward the exterior cellar doors she had just entered through. Following Alden's instructions, she walked over to them, flipped the heavy brass thumb-turned deadbolt, and slid a secondary steel reinforcement bar across the frame. She had just sealed us both inside. There was no longer an exit to the backyard. The only way out of this acoustic vault was up the narrow, carpeted stairs, through the drilled steel door, and into the main house. I watched through the slats as Serafina turned her attention toward those interior stairs. She moved with agonizing slowness, placing her feet carefully on the plush carpet to avoid making a sound. She raised the gun, the silencer pointing directly at the cracked steel door above. She assumed I had fled upward. She assumed I was cowering in my bedroom, frantically dialing 911 or packing a bag. She had absolutely no idea I was standing less than 10 feet behind her. As she placed her foot on the first step of the staircase, a terrifying, electrifying clarity washed over me. The Linnea who had pushed peas around a plate, the Linnea who had accepted second place her entire life, the Linnea who had dutifully cooked meals for a man who viewed her as disposable garbage, that woman died right there, in the dark, suffocating cedar smell of the closet. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness. I was the holder of the $15 million secret, and I was standing inside the very trap they had built for me. Serafina took another step up, then another. She was halfway up the flight of stairs, her back entirely exposed to the room. I could stay in the closet. I could wait for her to enter the main house, sneak out behind her, and try to unlock the exterior doors. But the steel reinforcement bar she had dropped across the frame was heavy. Lifting it would make a loud, scraping sound. She would hear it, turn around, and shoot me from the top of the stairs. I couldn't run. I had to trap her. My eyes darted to the top of the stairs. The massive biometric steel door was designed to swing outward into the upstairs hallway. When Marcus the locksmith had drilled the locking mechanism, he had disabled the electronic bolt, but the door itself was still a 400-pound monolith of solid reinforced steel. If I could get to that door before she did, if I could pull it shut from the upstairs hallway and jam it, she would be locked inside the acoustic vault. But to do that, I had to follow her up the stairs. Without her hearing me, Serafina reached the top landing. She pushed the heavy steel door open an inch further, peering into the dark hallway of the main house. The gun was leveled perfectly in front of her. Linnea, she cooed, her voice echoing softly through the upstairs corridor, dripping with a sickening, playful malice. Linnea, sweetheart, come out wherever you are. Your big sister has a surprise for you. She stepped through the doorway, her body completely crossing the threshold into the main house. This was my only window. I pushed the louvered closet doors open. The hinges, meticulously oiled by Alden's obsessive maintenance, made absolutely no sound. I stepped out onto the Persian rug. My pulse was roaring in my ears so loudly I was certain she could hear it. I moved toward the staircase, placing my feet exactly where she had walked, minimizing the displacement of the carpet fibers. Above me, in the main house hallway, I heard the floorboards creak. Serafina was moving toward the kitchen. She hadn't bothered to close the heavy steel door behind her. It stood wide open, a gaping, metallic maw. I ascended the stairs. My breath was trapped in my throat. Every step felt like walking across a tightrope suspended over an active volcano. I kept my eyes pinned to the doorway, waiting for her shadow to reappear, waiting for the suppressed barrel of the handgun to pivot back and end my life. I reached the top landing. I peeked around the edge of the steel frame. The upstairs hallway was bathed in the amber glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the front windows. 30 feet down the hall, Serafina was standing in the doorway of my graphic design office, sweeping the room with the gun. Her back was to me. The heavy steel door had a massive industrial handle on the outside. If I pulled it shut, the drilled deadbolt wouldn't engage automatically. The lock was destroyed. But sitting on a decorative console table just 2 feet from the door was a heavy, cast-iron bookend, a replica of a Gothic gargoyle Alden had purchased at an antique auction. I stepped fully into the upstairs hallway. The friction of my sock against the hardwood floor made a microscopic, whispering sound. Swoosh. At the end of the hall, Serafina froze. Her shoulders tensed. She didn't turn her body, but her head snapped to the side, listening. "Linnea?" she whispered, the playful malice gone, replaced by a razor-sharp, lethal focus. I didn't breathe. I lunged. I grabbed the gargoyle bookend with my left hand and seized the massive handle of the steel door with my right. Serafina spun around, her eyes locked onto mine. For one shattered fraction of a second, the universe suspended itself. I saw the absolute shock register on her face as she realized I wasn't cowering in a corner. I was standing at the gates of her subterranean kingdom. She raised the gun. I hauled the 400-pound steel door toward me with every ounce of adrenaline and hysterical strength my body could generate. Twip. The suppressed gunshot sounded like a violent sneeze. A bullet tore through the air, shattering the plaster wall less than 3 inches from my left ear, showering my shoulder in white dust. I slammed the steel door shut. The impact shook the foundation of the house. Instantly, I shoved the heavy, cast-iron gargoyle bookend under the bottom edge of the door, violently wedging it between the hardwood floor and the steel frame. It acted as an immovable, mechanical chalk. On the other side of the door, an explosive, muffled scream of rage erupted. Something heavy, presumably her shoulder, slammed against the steel. The door rattled violently in its frame, but the cast-iron wedge held absolute firm. She couldn't pull the door open from the inside because there was no handle. It was designed to be pushed from the basement stairs. And she couldn't push it outward because the gargoyle was digging relentlessly into the hardwood. She was trapped. "Linnea!" Serafina shrieked, her voice muffled by the thick acoustic paneling of the stairwell, but vibrating with a demonic, unhinged fury. "Open this door! Open it right now, you pathetic little bitch, or I swear to God I will skin you alive." Another suppressed gunshot hit the inside of the steel door. Ping. The reinforced vault-grade metal didn't even dent. Alden had built this door to withstand a structural collapse. He had built it to keep the world out. Now, it was keeping his precious, murderous secret entirely sealed within. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, the white plaster dust settling into my hair. I stared at the immovable steel barrier, listening to the muffled sounds of her screaming and battering herself against it. I had her. I had the ghost locked in the tomb. But the victory was cold and entirely temporary. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking methodically at the end of the hallway. 4:32 p.m. Alden was skipping his flight to Zurich. He was renting an off-grid vehicle. He was driving back to Hartford to help stage a suicide. I had trapped the Queen, but the King was currently barreling down an interstate, entirely unaware that the board had been flipped. He was coming here to put a nylon rope around my neck. I couldn't just call the police. If I called 911, the local authorities would arrive. Alden would show up with a team of high-powered corporate lawyers. He would spin a web of lies. He would claim Serafina was a deranged stalker who had broken in. He would claim he knew nothing about the basement, that the contractors must have done it. He had $15 million to manipulate the justice system, and I had a ruined biometric door and a crazy story. No, the police weren't enough. I didn't just want them arrested. I wanted them annihilated. I wanted the Vance family, the insurance conglomerate, and the entire world to witness the absolute, undeniable destruction of Alden and Serafina's empire. To do that, I needed the evidence that was currently locked in the basement with her. The flash drive in the server rack, the life insurance documents, the journal. But I couldn't open that door. If I did, she would shoot me. I stood in the quiet hallway of the house I had dutifully cleaned for 5 years, staring at the steel door, a terrifying, beautiful, apocalyptic plan beginning to bloom in the darkest corners of my mind. Alden told Serafina to use the nylon rope in the utility closet to stage my suicide. He wanted a theatrical production. He wanted a narrative. I decided it was time to write a narrative of my own. I walked into the kitchen, picked up my car keys, and grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the pantry toolkit. I wasn't running away. I was going to prepare the stage for my husband's grand return. I tightened my grip on the heavy steel crowbar. The cold, industrial weight of the metal grounded me, acting as a physical anchor against the dizzying, hurricane-force winds of adrenaline howling through my mind. I didn't run. I walked. I moved through the kitchen with the precise, methodical cadence of a woman who had just been completely hollowed out and refilled with something dangerously sharp. Alden and Serafina had built an impenetrable fortress beneath my feet. They had sealed it, soundproofed it, and weaponized it to ensure their $15 million secret remained undisturbed. But every fortress has a vulnerability. Every sealed environment relies on an external lung to breathe. I bypassed the front door and moved quietly through the side utility exit, stepping out into the late afternoon heat. The Connecticut woods surrounding our property were dense and overgrown, casting long, fractured shadows across the manicured lawn. I walked around the perimeter of the sprawling Victorian house, tracing the foundation line until I found what I was looking for. Hidden behind a thick cluster of manicured rhododendron bushes was the exterior cellar access, the heavy steel storm doors Serafina had unlocked from the inside just minutes ago. But right next to those doors, housed in a reinforced mesh cage, was a massive commercial-grade HVAC compressor unit. It was the dedicated life support system for the acoustic vault. It pumped pristine, climate-controlled air down into the soundproof bunker, ensuring the environment remained perfectly hospitable for a pregnant woman in hiding. I raised the crowbar. I didn't just hit the control panel, I obliterated it. The heavy steel-hooked end of the crowbar smashed through the digital display, shattering the plastic casing and tearing into the complex nest of copper wiring beneath. Sparks showered over my sneakers in a brilliant, hissing cascade. The rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the compressor shuddered, whined like a dying animal, and ground to an absolute permanent halt. The silence that followed was immense. Without that compressor, the airtight, soundproofed basement was no longer a luxury apartment. It was a hermetically sealed box. The oxygen supply would stagnate, the temperature would slowly begin to rise. Serafina wasn't in immediate danger of suffocating a space that large held enough ambient air to sustain her for hours, but the psychological terror of being plunged into a stagnant, unventilated tomb would be absolute. I wanted her to feel the walls closing in. I wanted her to experience a fraction of the suffocation I had endured for the last 5 years, living under the crushing weight of her ghost. But I wasn't finished with the exterior. I moved to the heavy steel storm doors. They were already shut and bolted from the inside, secured by the reinforcement bar Serafina had dropped into place to prevent my escape. I jammed the flattened end of the crowbar deep into the heavy external hinges. Using all my leverage, I pushed down with a violent grunt. The thick metal brackets shrieked and bent, warping the hinge pins beyond repair. I did the same to the second hinge, and then the third. The heavy doors were now permanently wedged into their concrete frame. Even if Serafina somehow managed to lift the interior reinforcement bar, the doors would not open. She was entombed. I walked back inside the house, the silence of the main floor wrapping around me like a heavy velvet cloak. I checked the grandfather clock in the hallway, 4:55 p.m. Alden was on the road. Assuming he drove with the reckless, arrogant speed of a man trying to outrun a murder charge, he would be pulling into our gravel driveway in less than 3 hours. I had roughly 180 minutes to construct a snare that $15 million and a team of high-priced corporate lawyers couldn't dismantle. I walked upstairs to my graphic design office. The room was flooded with the warm, amber light of the setting sun. My workstation, a high-end multi-monitor rig I used for rendering massive visual projects, sat quietly on the massive oak desk. I didn't need to call the police to tell them a story. I needed to broadcast a documentary. I opened a secure encrypted cloud storage account that I used exclusively for backing up massive client files. Then, I went to my equipment closet. I pulled out 3 high-definition, wide-angle webcams and 2 studio-grade condenser microphones. I spent the next 45 minutes meticulously wiring the house. I hid the first camera on the top shelf of the massive bookshelf in the foyer, perfectly angled to capture the front door and the sweeping spiral staircase. I placed the second camera in the living room, nestled discreetly behind a heavy, opaque crystal vase on the mantel. The third went onto the second-floor landing, pointing straight down at the entrance. I ran the cables under the edges of the antique rugs, taping them securely against the baseboards where Alden's frantic eyes would never think to look. I routed all the feeds back to my office computer, launching a professional broadcasting software. On my primary monitor, a mosaic of crystal-clear video feeds popped up, covering every possible angle of the main floor. The audio levels danced in the green, picking up even the faintest rustle of my clothing. But capturing the footage was only half the trap. I needed to guarantee its delivery. I opened my email client and began typing. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, fueled by a cold, calculating rage. I addressed the email to the lead fraud investigator of the global life insurance conglomerate, a name I had memorized from the legal documents I'd seen in the basement just an hour ago. I added the private, personal email address of my father, Arthur Vance. And finally, I added the email for the district attorney's major crimes division. The subject line was simple, devoid of any hyperbole. Evidence of $15 million life insurance fraud and attempted homicide, Serafina and Alden Vance. In the body of the email, I wrote a brief, clinical summary of everything I had discovered. The drilled biometric door. The subterranean luxury apartment. The surveillance system. The prenatal vitamins. I included the direct URL to the live encrypted video stream of my house, along with the master password to access the cloud drive where the recording was being simultaneously backed up. Then I engaged the email client's delayed send function. I set the timer for exactly 11:00 p.m. If I didn't physically sit down at this computer and cancel the command by 11 o'clock tonight, the email would automatically fire. The live feed, the cloud access, the entire explosive truth would detonate across the inboxes of the people who had the power to freeze their accounts, arrest them, and obliterate their lives. Even if Alden managed to kill me, even if he managed to stage my suicide perfectly and burn this house to the ground, the digital ghost of my vengeance would still hunt him down and destroy him. I stared at the blinking countdown timer on my screen, the ultimate dead man's switch. Now, I just needed to dress the set for my husband's arrival. I left the office and walked down the hall to the small utility closet. Alden had been incredibly specific on his phone call with Serafina. Use the braided nylon rope in the utility closet. You catch her off guard. You secure it around her neck, and you drop her from the second-floor banister. I opened the closet door. There it was, resting neatly on a shelf next to the spare light bulbs and extension cords. A thick, heavy coil of white nylon rope. I picked it up. It felt rough and abrasive against my palms. The sheer, clinical premeditation of it made my stomach turn over. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a logistical pivot. They had purchased this rope with the express intent of wrapping it around my throat the moment I outlived my usefulness as their alibi. I carried the coil out to the second-floor landing, overlooking the grand, 2-story foyer. I am not a sailor, but graphic design requires a deep understanding of geometry and tension. I spent 20 minutes tying a flawless, textbook hangman's knot. I wrapped the thick nylon around itself exactly 13 times, pulling the loop tight until it formed a brutal, unyielding mechanism of death. I secured the opposite end of the rope tightly to the heavy, wrought iron balustrade of the second-floor railing. I let the noose drop. It swung out over the cavernous space of the foyer, the heavy knot pulling it taut. It dangled in the dead center of the room, suspended exactly at eye level for anyone walking through the heavy mahogany front doors. It was a grotesque, macabre chandelier, the centerpiece of Alden's planned tragedy, presented to him on a silver platter. I stepped back, admiring the horrifying symmetry of the scene. The cameras were recording. The noose was hung. The dead man's switch was counting down in the office. But I was still wearing my comfortable, everyday clothes, a soft beige sweater, and fitted jeans. I looked like a woman preparing to run errands, not a woman standing at the epicenter of a gothic nightmare. Alden was a man obsessed with aesthetics. He appreciated the visual weight of a moment. I needed to give him a visual that would completely short-circuit his perfectly organized sociopathic brain. I walked into the master bedroom. I ignored the closet I shared with Alden and walked directly to the large cedar-lined storage chest at the foot of the bed. I threw the lid open and dug past the heavy winter quilts until my fingers brushed against a garment bag I hadn't touched in exactly 5 years. I unzipped the thick plastic. Inside was a stark, severe, floor-length black dress with a high collar and long sleeves, accompanied by a black, netted fascinator veil. It was the exact outfit I had worn to Serafina's funeral. I stripped off my everyday clothes, my skin shivering in the cool, air-conditioned air of the master bedroom. I pulled the heavy black mourning dress over my head. It fit tighter than it had 5 years ago, constricting my ribs, acting as a physical armor. I pinned the black veil into my hair, letting the dark, netted fabric fall over my face, partially obscuring my eyes. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I didn't look like Linnea Vance, the quiet, accommodating younger sister. I looked like a vengeful apparition. I looked like the ghost of the tragedy they had manufactured. I walked out of the bedroom and returned to the second-floor landing. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, plunging the Connecticut woods into a deep, impenetrable blackness. Inside the house, I turned off every single light on the main floor, save for a single, dim, amber sconce in the foyer. The faint light cast long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood floors, illuminating the dangling nylon noose in stark, dramatic relief. Then, I sat down in a high-backed accent chair situated in the deep shadows of the second-floor landing, completely invisible from the front door below. I rested the heavy steel crowbar across my lap, and I waited. The house was agonizingly quiet. With the HVAC compressor destroyed, there was no ambient hum to mask the sheer emptiness of the massive structure. But occasionally, if I strained my ears, I could hear it. A faint, muffled, desperate rhythm vibrating up through the floorboards from the center of the hallway. Thump, thump, thump. Serafina. She was still beating her fists against the unyielding, gargoyle-wedged steel door at the top of the basement stairs. But the strikes were no longer furious and sustained. They were erratic, weak. The air inside the acoustic vault was undoubtedly growing stale and hot. Her panic was likely consuming her oxygen at an accelerated rate. For a woman used to controlling every single variable of her existence, the absolute impotence of her situation must have been driving her to the very edge of madness. Her muffled strikes were the metronome to my waiting, a symphony of trapped arrogance. 7:15 p.m. 7:30 p.m. The tension in the house was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My muscles cramped from holding completely still, but I refused to adjust my posture. The cameras were rolling, silently capturing the empty, shadowed foyer and the slowly twisting noose. At exactly 7:48 p.m., a sweeping beam of white light sliced through the darkness of the front windows. A car was coming up the long gravel driveway. It wasn't the aggressive roar of Alden's classic Porsche. It was the stealthy, muted purr of a generic, modern sedan, a rental car, procured off the grid, just as he had promised Serafina. The engine cut out. The headlights died, plunging the front yard back into absolute darkness. The heavy crunch of gravel under expensive leather dress shoes echoed through the silent night. He was walking toward the front door. He wasn't trying to be overly stealthy. He assumed I was either already dead, brutally murdered by his pregnant mistress, or cowering somewhere inside waiting for him to play the savior. A key slid into the brass deadbolt of the front door. Click. The heavy mahogany door pushed inward. The cool night air spilled into the foyer, disturbing the hanging nylon rope, causing it to spin slowly on its axis. Alden stepped across the threshold. He was dressed exactly as I imagined he would be. A tailored dark wool overcoat, black slacks, a black turtleneck. He carried a heavy, nondescript black leather duffel bag likely filled with cash, passports, and whatever cleaning supplies he deemed necessary to stage a flawless crime scene. He closed the front door behind him with a soft, practiced click. He reached out and flipped the main light switch for the foyer chandelier. Nothing happened. I had manually unscrewed the bulbs from the fixture an hour ago. The only light remained the dim, amber glow of the wall sconce. Alden frowned, his perfect, symmetrical features pulling into a mask of irritation. He took a step further into the foyer, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then, he walked right into the swinging nylon noose. The coarse rope brushed against his cheek. Alden recoiled violently, dropping the heavy leather duffel bag to the floor with a loud, dense thud. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his coat pocket, his eyes wide with a sudden, jarring shock. He stared at the empty, perfectly tied hangman's knot dangling at eye level. He scanned the empty foyer, his chest heaving, his calculated composure fracturing for the very first time. He looked at the overturned rug. He looked at the pristine, undisturbed furniture. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no dead wife. Just a meticulously staged prop from a script he had written, hanging empty in his own house. Serafina? Alden hissed into the darkness, his voice tight, stripped of its usual melodic charm. He kept his right hand buried deep in the pocket of his wool overcoat. He was armed. Sarah, where are you? What the hell is this? He took a cautious step toward the center of the room, positioning himself directly beneath the second-floor landing. It was time. I stood up from the high-backed accent chair. The black morning dress flowed around me, rustling softly in the oppressive silence. I stepped forward, moving out of the deep shadows and into the faint, amber light spilling over the balustrade. I looked down at the man who had stolen my life. She's not available to greet you, Alden, I said. My voice was calm, resonant, and completely devoid of the trembling, eager-to-please inflection I had used for 5 years. It echoed off the vaulted ceiling, hitting Alden with the force of a physical blow. Alden's head snapped upward. When he saw me standing there alive, uninjured, and dressed in the severe black mourning gown and veil from his fake fiancée's funeral, the color instantly drained from his face. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. For 5 years, he had treated me like an obtuse, invisible ghost. Now, he was staring at a living nightmare. Linnea, he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The shock paralyzed him, locking his feet to the hardwood floor. He looked at the empty noose, then back up to me, his brilliant, sociopathic mind frantically trying to process how the prey had reorganized the trap. You're home early from Zurich, I said, leaning casually against the wrought iron railing, the heavy steel crowbar resting visibly in my left hand. I was expecting you to be finalizing the transfer of the final offshore blocks. Did the 15 million clear, or did my little discovery interrupt the itinerary? Alden swallowed hard. The mention of the exact dollar amount severed the last remaining strings of his grieving husband facade. The mask fell away entirely. The gentle, warm eyes that had charmed my parents and seduced me turned into 2 chips of black ice. Where is she? Alden demanded, his voice dropping into a lethal, guttural register. He pulled his right hand from his coat pocket. He wasn't holding a suppressed handgun like Serafina. He was holding a sleek, silver taser. He still wanted to stick to the plan. He wanted to stun me, hang me, and stage the suicide. She's exactly where you put her, Alden, I replied, tracing the edge of the crowbar with my thumb. Downstairs. In the dark. But you might want to hurry. The HVAC compressor seems to have suffered a catastrophic failure about 3 hours ago. It's getting awfully stuffy down there for a pregnant woman. Alden's eyes widened in genuine, unadulterated horror. You shut off the air? He snarled, taking a step toward the base of the spiral staircase. If you hurt her, Linnea, I swear to God I will. You will what? I interrupted, my voice slicing through his threat like a guillotine. Kill me? Frame me for suicide? Cash out the insurance money and move to the Maldives to name your baby Arthur? You're a little late for the exposition, Alden. I read the journal. I saw the cameras. I know everything. I took a step back from the railing, moving toward the top of the stairs, keeping myself perfectly framed in the shot of the hidden webcams. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to incriminate himself on the live feed. She has a gun, Linnea, Alden said, attempting to regain control of the narrative, trying to weaponize his arrogance. He began walking slowly up the stairs, the silver taser humming softly as he activated it. If you locked her in there, she'll shoot through the door. You're out of your depth. You're a graphic designer. You push pixels around a screen. I have resources you can't even fathom. Give me the key, let me get her out, and I will let you walk away with enough money to disappear. If you fight me, you die in this house tonight. It is that simple. She already tried shooting through the door, I said, offering him a cold, empty smile. Vault-grade steel is incredibly resilient, isn't it? You built that basement to keep the world out. You did a fantastic job. It's keeping her in perfectly. Alden stopped halfway up the stairs. His eyes darted to the hallway behind me, trying to calculate the logistics of the breached door. The biometric lock, he muttered, piecing it together. You drilled it. You jammed it from this side. With the cast iron gargoyle you bought in Boston, I confirmed cheerfully. A wonderful piece of structural leverage. You stupid, arrogant bitch, Alden seethed, his facade of composed negotiation vanishing. He charged up the remaining stairs, raising the sparking taser, fully intent on driving the electrical prongs directly into my chest. I didn't run. I stood my ground at the top of the landing. I wouldn't take another step, Alden, I warned, my voice echoing loudly for the hidden microphones to capture perfectly. Unless you want Arthur and Eleanor Vance, along with the district attorney and the fraud division of your insurance conglomerate, to watch you murder me in high definition. Alden froze, his foot hovering over the final step. The sparking of the taser abruptly stopped. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his eyes frantically scanning the dark, vaulted ceiling of the foyer. "I have 3 studio-grade webcams streaming this entire confrontation to an encrypted cloud server," I said, gesturing broadly to the living room below and the bookshelf behind him. "The audio is crystal clear. You just admitted to faking her death. You just threatened to kill me. You just admitted she has a gun. And right now there is an email sitting on a delayed send timer in my office. If I don't stop it by 11 o'clock, the link to this live feed goes directly to the people who will freeze your Cayman accounts and send you both to federal prison for the rest of your miserable lives." Alden stood paralyzed on the top step, the silver taser lowering slightly. The sheer magnitude of the counterstrike crashed over him. His pristine, flawlessly executed $15 million fraud had just been detonated by the woman he considered too pathetic to even notice. "You're bluffing," he sneered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. A bead of sweat rolled down his perfectly sculpted jawline. "You don't have the technical capability to set that up. I'm a digital designer, Alden," I said softly, stepping closer to him, the heavy crowbar held firmly at my side. "I build encrypted client portals for a living. You underestimated me because you spent 5 years looking right through me. But I see you now. I see exactly what you are." A sudden, muffled, agonizing scream drifted up from the hallway behind me. It was Serafina. Her voice was weak, raspy, completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. The oxygen in the vault was undoubtedly depleting. The heat was rising. She was breaking. "Alden!" her muffled voice cried out, a pathetic, desperate wail that vibrated through the floorboards. "Alden, please! I can't breathe!" Alden's eyes snapped toward the hallway. The sound of his golden child, his pregnant mistress, begging for air shattered his final defense. He lunged past me, sprinting down the dark corridor toward the basement door. I let him go. I didn't swing the crowbar. I just turned and followed him, watching the final act of their tragic play unfold. Alden slammed into the heavy steel door with the desperation of a caged animal. He grabbed the massive industrial handle, planting his expensive leather shoes against the doorframe, and pulled with a guttural, strained roar. The muscles in his back coiled tightly beneath his tailored wool coat, but the door didn't yield a single millimeter. The cast-iron gargoyle I had wedged beneath the bottom edge was perfectly positioned. The harder Alden pulled, the deeper the Gothic horns of the bookend dug into the polished hardwood floor, effectively locking the door against its own massive weight. "Sarah! Sarah, I'm here!" Alden screamed, pressing his face against the cold, unyielding steel. From deep within the acoustic vault, a muffled, hysterical sob echoed back. "Alden, get me out! It's so hot. I can't breathe." She broke the air conditioning. "Alden, she's trying to kill us!" Alden dropped to his knees, his perfectly styled hair falling wildly across his forehead. He clawed frantically at the cast-iron gargoyle, his manicured fingernails scraping uselessly against the heavy metal. But he had no leverage. He couldn't pry it loose with his bare hands while the massive weight of the door rested entirely upon it. He needed a tool. He needed leverage. He slowly turned his head, looking back down the dark hallway. I was standing 10 feet away, watching him from the shadows, the heavy steel crowbar resting comfortably in my grip. The transformation in Alden's eyes was nothing short of cinematic. The polished, affluent architect, the masterful manipulator who had spent 5 years treating my life like an expendable chess piece, was completely gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified man who finally realized that the board had been flipped, and he was completely out of moves. "Linnea," he gasped, his voice cracking, the tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. He raised his hands in a gesture of total surrender. "Please. Please, Linnea. You win. You've won. You have the cameras, you have the email, you have everything. Just give me the crowbar. Let me pry the wedge loose. She's pregnant. Whatever she did to you, whatever I did to you, the baby doesn't deserve to die in the dark." It was the ultimate manipulation. The final, desperate play for my empathy. He was banking on the fact that I was still the soft, compliant girl who had spent her entire life absorbing other people's pain. He thought the mention of an innocent life would force my hand, causing me to crumble and hand over the weapon. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, surgical precision. "The baby won't die, Alden," I said quietly, my voice ringing clear in the silent corridor. "The basement is over 2,000 square feet. Even without the compressor, there is enough ambient oxygen in that room to keep her breathing for at least 12 hours. She's not suffocating. She's just experiencing a mild, psychological inconvenience. She's experiencing what it feels like to have her reality completely controlled by someone else. Consider it an exercise in empathy." "You're a monster," Alden hissed, his facade of surrender vanishing instantly, replaced by a venomous, unadulterated hatred. "I'm a mirror, Alden," I corrected him. "I am simply reflecting your own architecture back at you." Alden's eyes darted from my face to the heavy steel crowbar in my hand. He did the math. He realized that reasoning with me was impossible, and intimidation had failed. He had one option left. He had the silver taser in his coat pocket. He thought he was faster than me. He thought the sheer physical disparity between us would guarantee his victory. He lunged. He pushed off the hardwood floor with explosive speed, drawing the taser, the electrical prongs crackling to life with a bright, blue-white arc of electricity. He aimed directly for my chest, intending to drive 50,000 volts through my heart, incapacitate me, take the crowbar, and then deal with the live feed in my office. But I had spent 5 years observing the precise mechanics of how Alden moved. I didn't step backward. I stepped sideways, pivoting on my heel, allowing his forward momentum to carry him past me. As he stumbled into the empty space where I had just been standing, I swung the heavy steel crowbar with a brutal, two-handed baseball bat arc. Crack. The heavy metal connected squarely with the side of Alden's right knee. The sound of the joint shattering was sickeningly loud, echoing down the hallway like a dry branch snapping in the dead of winter. Alden let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream. The taser flew from his grip, skittering uselessly across the hardwood floor, sparking wildly before shorting out against the baseboard. Alden collapsed in a heap, clutching his shattered leg, writhing on the floor in absolute, blinding agony. The tailored wool coat rode up his back, exposing the pathetic, broken reality of the man who had thought himself a god. I stood over him, my breathing steady, the crowbar still gripped firmly in my hands. I didn't feel a shred of remorse. I watched him weep, his tears leaving wet tracks through the plaster dust that had settled on his cheek from Serafina's gunshot earlier. "You broke my leg," he sobbed, coughing violently as the pain radiated through his nervous system. "You broke my fucking leg." "I broke your foundation, Alden," I said softly. "The house is just settling." I stepped over his writhing body and walked calmly down the hall, entering my graphic design office. The monitors were glowing brightly in the dark room, displaying the perfect, high-definition mosaic of my vengeance. On the feed from the living room, I could see the reflection of the empty nylon noose twisting gently in the foyer. On the feed from the hallway, I could see Alden crawling on his stomach, dragging his shattered leg behind him, leaving a smear of blood and dust on the polished hardwood. I sat down in my ergonomic desk chair. I pulled the keyboard toward me. The delayed send timer on my email client was methodically counting down. 8 hours, 14 minutes, and 32 seconds remaining. I moved the mouse cursor over the timer. I didn't want to wait until 11 o'clock anymore. The stage was set. The actors had delivered their final lines. The curtain was ready to fall. I clicked cancel delay. A prompt popped up on the screen. Send message now? I took a deep, expanding breath. I thought about the 16-year-old girl walking home in the rain with a poetry certificate nobody wanted to see. I thought about the 26-year-old woman standing at a fake gravesite, absorbing the grief of a family that had never truly loved her. I thought about the 32-year-old wife who had spent 5 years apologizing for taking up space in her own home. I pressed enter. The email client swooshed. The message was gone. In that exact fraction of a second, the $15 million empire of Alden and Serafina Vance ceased to exist. The live video links, the cloud storage access, the offshore routing numbers, the undeniable proof of the pregnancy and the survival of the golden child it was currently detonating in the inboxes of the district attorney, the lead insurance fraud investigator, and my father, Arthur Vance. I stood up from the desk. I walked out of the office and stood in the hallway. Alden had managed to drag himself back to the steel door. He was leaning against the frame, weeping openly, his face pale and clammy from the shock of his shattered knee. He looked up at me, his eyes entirely hollowed out, the arrogant light completely extinguished. I walked over to him. I looked down at his trembling, blood-stained hands. I took the heavy steel crowbar and tossed it onto the floor, letting it clatter loudly right next to him. "The email is gone, Alden," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "The district attorney has the feed. The insurance company has the offshore accounts. Arthur and Eleanor are probably watching you crawl on this floor right now." Alden closed his eyes, a ragged, broken sob tearing its way out of his throat. He slumped against the wall, defeated, ruined, a king without a kingdom. "You have about 12 minutes before the local police arrive," I continued, adjusting the black netted veil of my morning dress. "If you start prying right now, you might just be able to get that gargoyle loose before the SWAT team breaches the front door. You might be able to hold her hand when they put the handcuffs on both of you. I suggest you start working." I didn't wait for his response. I turned my back on the man I had married and walked down the sweeping spiral staircase. I passed beneath the dangling nylon noose, leaving it exactly where it was. Let the detectives see the murder weapon they had prepared for me. Let the jury see the sheer, sociopathic malice of their contingency plan. Let the entire world look at the beautiful, tragic widower and the resplendent, miraculous sister, and see them for the grotesque, rotting monsters they truly were. I opened the heavy mahogany front door and stepped out into the cool, crisp Connecticut night. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I walked down the long gravel driveway, my black morning dress billowing behind me like a shadow finally breaking free from its host. By the time I reached the main road, I could hear them. The wail of sirens in the distance. Not just one or two, an entire fleet. The district attorney had clearly seen the email. The cavalry was coming. I kept walking, disappearing into the darkness, leaving the Victorian house and its subterranean secrets to the flashing red and blue lights that were about to consume it. The fallout was biblical. The trial of Alden and Serafina Vance became the most sensational, highly publicized criminal event of the decade. The media dubbed it the Lazarus Fraud. For 6 months, the news cycles were entirely dominated by the sheer, staggering audacity of their crimes. The prosecution didn't even have to work hard. The evidence I had provided was absolute, irrefutable, and damning beyond measure. The live video feeds, the encrypted cloud drives, the journal, the prenatal pharmacy receipts. Alden and Serafina tried to turn on each other, of course. Monsters always do when the cage gets too small. Alden claimed Serafina had manipulated him, that she had threatened to ruin his career if he didn't help her fake her death. Serafina claimed Alden had held her hostage in the basement, that the pregnancy was forced, that she was a victim of his psychotic obsession. But the jury had seen the journal. They had read Serafina's own handwriting detailing her sheer amusement at my humiliation. They had heard Alden's voice on the audio feed, calmly instructing her to hang me from the banister and stage it as a suicide. They were both convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted homicide. The life insurance conglomerate seized every single asset they owned, liquidating the offshore accounts, repossessing the Victorian house, and completely vaporizing their wealth. The judge handed down consecutive maximum sentences. Alden received 65 years without the possibility of parole. Serafina, who gave birth to a healthy baby boy while in federal custody, received 60 years. The baby, little Arthur, was immediately surrendered to the state foster care system. But the legal destruction was nothing compared to the psychological devastation of Arthur and Eleanor Vance. My parents had spent 5 years treating Serafina's memory like a sacred religion. When the truth broke when they received my email and watched the live feed of their golden child, alive, pregnant, and actively plotting the brutal murder of their younger daughter, their minds simply could not process the paradox. The cognitive dissonance was too massive. My mother suffered a severe nervous breakdown and was institutionalized for 3 months. My father, stripped of his pride and his legacy, aged 20 years in a matter of weeks. They tried to contact me, of course. They sent letters. They left voicemails, weeping, begging for forgiveness, begging to see me, begging to rebuild the family they had so callously discarded. I never answered a single one. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it is not a mandatory requirement for healing. Some bridges are burned with such absolute malice that rebuilding them would only lead you back to the very people who set the fire in the first place. I had spent 32 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was fundamentally rotten. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their tears. I needed my absolute, unadulterated peace. I legally changed my name. I relocated to a vibrant, sun-drenched coastal city on the opposite side of the country. I took the graphic design business I had built in that oppressive Victorian house and expanded it into a highly successful, multi-million-dollar boutique creative agency. I surround myself with people who see me, people who value my voice, people who don't ask me to shrink, to hide, or to play the understudy to someone else's blinding light. Sometimes, late at night, when the ocean breeze rattles the windows of my penthouse apartment, I think about that basement. I think about the flawless, climate-controlled vault, the Persian rugs, the emerald green dress, and the vintage vanity. I think about the staggering lengths people will go to in order to maintain an illusion of perfection. But then I look out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of dark water reflecting the brilliant, undeniable light of the moon, and I smile. They thought they could bury me. They thought they could lock me above their secrets and use my invisible, quiet life as a shield for their monstrous greed. They underestimated the most fundamental law of nature. When you spend your entire life living in the shadows, you learn how to see perfectly in the dark. You learn the architecture of the silence. And when the time comes to strike, you don't need to scream, and you don't need to make a scene. You just need to find the lock, turn the key, and let the truth burn the entire house down. My name is Linnea. I am 33 years old. And for the first time in my entire life, I am the only one standing in the sun.